Hi, everyone. I'm Chao Wei. I'm the faculty with the Institute for International Economic Policy and the Department of Economics at the George Washington University. The Institute has made a point of inviting both senior established researchers and young promising scholars so we can build a community of different generations of researchers on China. So our session features different cohorts of economists on China issues. Our first speaker, Hongbin is the James Liang Director of the China Program at Stanford University. He has published extensively on behavior of government and the human capital investment and labor market in China. Our second speaker, Gary Jefferson, Professor of International Trade and Finance from Brandeis University. He's an expert on economic development and the economics of innovation on China. Our third speaker, Andrew Greenland, is an assistant professor of economics at Elon University. He has been studying the impact of China shocks on labor market conditions and human capital investment in the United States. So we are very happy to have our first speaker, Hongbin, to give his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Chao. So this is my second time to speak here. So last time was like 6-7 years ago. At that time, I just checked the website. I talk about China's evolving labor market, actually. So that's actually the title of one of the papers I published in GEP, General Economic Perspectives, back then. So this year I had another piece in the, I think the winter issue of the GEP. There's a special issue on China. Actually, Shangjin also had a piece in that issue. So I'm going to talk about that paper a little bit. If I have time, I'm going to talk about something else about education as well. So depending on how much time I have. So let me first talk about this education and growth paper. So if you think about a simple model, this is very easy, actually. If we have economic growth, we can decompose it into two parts. One is growth of quantity, labor. The second part is growth of labor productivity. So the two add up to growth of a country, or GDP growth. So if we think about China using this simple model, in terms of quantity, China actually, the labor force increased a lot. So in the past 40 years also, China's labor force increased from like 600 million to 1 billion. So a rise by like about 80%. China's labor also could move. Before they couldn't move from the rural areas to the urban areas, from agriculture to industry and services. China's labor also were allowed to move from the state-owned sector to the private sector. China didn't have a private sector until the 80s and 90s. So now the private sector is employing like 83% of China's workers. There are still 17% employed by the SOEs and the government. So in terms of the labor productivity, one important contributor of labor productivity is education or human capital. China's human capital or education has also improved quite a lot in the past 30 or 40 years. So the year of schooling increased from 4 to almost 10 years. The number of college graduates in the labor force increased from only almost nothing in the 80s 1% to about 12.5% until 2 years ago. But if we look at, this is the past actually. If we look into the future, the picture is different. What has changed is that the increase of quantity of moving labor from one sector to the other sectors is almost ending actually. The reason is that because of the decline of fertility, China's labor force started to come down a few years ago. So every year, China's labor force declines about by the number of 3 million. So 3 million basically is a small city of China. And there are almost no young workers who are still staying in the countryside. So most of the young workers are already working in the cities, in the factories, or in the service sector. So one of my friends just did a survey. They showed that only 1 to 2% of labor between age 16 and 30 are still remaining in the rural areas working there, actually. Okay, let me use a simple economic model to link education to income. So this is a very simple cross-country fit of two variables. So on the x-axis is the year of schooling. On the vertical one is the per capita income or GDP. I fit this regression excluding China. US is in this regression. So this is the line. This is simple regression, only one variable. You know how large R square is? 80%, 0.8. So basically, this education variable is highly correlated with income of a country. US is exactly on the line, actually. Most countries are on the line or around along the line. China, this is the data in 1980. China is way below the line. What does it mean? So the line basically describes the average correlation between education and income of a country. If China is below the line, it means that given China's education, China's income was much lower than it should be in 1980, which means China's education was either had low quality or it was not used efficiently. So by saying that not used efficiently, I have a reason, because China was still a planned economy. Human capital was not rewarded in such an economy. So this was back in 1980. So also this line can explain about 25%. Let me skip this. If we fit the same line using cross-country data for 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, so you can see that US is always there, frontier, right? Somebody says US frontier growth. China moved from way below the line. This is 1990, right? Up. And by 2010, China is almost hitting the line. What does it mean? Means over time, there's two sources of growth. One growth is moving toward the line, closer to the line. The other is moving along the line. The first source basically is saying that China's return to human capital, or China's use of human capital, is becoming more efficient over time. Second, China's human capital is increasing. That also can drive growth. So how much of this is source as a percentage of the total growth? China grew by 10% roughly a year. So out of this 10%, about 6.5% is from growth toward the land. That means more efficient use of human capital, basically by having better technology, more machineries, and higher quality of human capital, all kinds of reasons. And the other 40% is explained by more human capital, increasing education. Of course, there's a minus 5%. That is caused by the moving of the land. Actually, the land is not, it's very stable, but still moves a little bit. Okay, this is the fit in 2014. You can see that China basically is on the line, 2014. What does it mean? On one hand, it's good news. It means China's reward to human capital or the efficiency of human capital use is similar to other countries in the world. There's no difference. China becoming a normal country. This is a new normal. But the bad news is that if we think about growth in the future, then there's no growth like in the past. That's the 65% of source, actually, growth source is moving toward the land. Because China is already on the land. In the future, if China is going to move, China will move along the land. Okay. Then I can calculate what will be the income in 20 years from now by predicting the education level 20 years from now. This is a very simple exercise. Economists are not fortune tellers, but I'm trying to forecast economic growth here using a simple model. So basically, economy toward the land is still a little bit. So I can calculate that in like 20 years, around 1 percentage point a year. So this is the remaining growth toward the land. How much will China grow along the land? That depends on how fast China can improve the education level of labor force. How fast can China do that? So we assume the most aggressive expansion of education starting from now. If the urban enrollment of high school can reach 100% by this year, actually, it's almost 100% or 95%. So if we can expand rural high school enrollment by 13% a year, that will reach 100% by 2020 also. This is the most aggressive expansion of education. If we also assume China's college can expand by 5% a year, currently China's college is not expanding actually. China expanded very fast in the 90s for 10 years and then slowed down. By this, we can calculate China's education level in 2035 actually. This is college, high school, college, and then years schooling. Basically, China's years schooling can improve by only 1.7 years from current level. Why is it so slow? Because you need to replace the labor force with a younger, more educated workers. This will take a long time, actually, because all the workers, all the workers who are existing in the labor market, they don't have much education. So if we use this, we can calculate the income level. This is PPP level, by the way. By 2035, it's around $25,000 US. This is not too bad, actually. This is similar to level of maybe what country? So maybe I forgot which country. Maybe Greece. Yeah, Greece today. So we can use the current PP level of $14,000 US, and then use these two numbers to calculate annual growth rate of GDP. So basically, using this model, you can predict, given the improvement of human capital, the speed, China can at most grow by 3% a year in the next 20 years. By the way, this is not too bad, actually. US, you just saw the picture, right? US growth rate is around this number in the past century. So there's no way China can grow at 7%. If China grew at 7% a year, China's income will reach the level of $55,000 US in 20 years, which is exactly the level of income of Americans today. If you look at the education level of Americans today, about 90% of Americans have at least high school degree. About half, slightly less than half, have a college degree. So China cannot reach this education level in 20 years. What is the policy implication of this? So the largest gap of education between China and the rest of the world is not college, actually, it's high school. China's proportion of high school graduates is way below not only the rich countries like Japan, US, also below other countries like Thailand, Mexico, and Turkey, these other countries. And the biggest gap actually is between actually high school education in rural areas and the rest of the world and urban areas actually. So in urban areas, you can see that most kids go to high school, but in rural areas, there's a recent article spreading like virus in WeChat actually. That was about actually Scott Rozelle, who happens to be my advisor actually at Stanford, so a good friend of mine. So basically, the survey showed that only about 35% rural kids finish high school. 65% do not have a high school diploma. So given the gap, there's room of improvement, and also there's challenges. Why are not kids going to high schools in rural China? First of all, I mean, rural schools are really poorly funded because especially in the poor counties, they don't have a lot of financial resources. Second, even more importantly for economists, they don't have incentives to really fund high schools because most kids, rural kids who finish high schools, they don't stay there. They will go to other places to work. So this is purely a negative benefit or purely cost. So rural kids also are not allowed to go to urban school if their parents happen to work in the urban areas. This has become a big challenge, but these kids are left behind with their grandpas. So one solution to this is this is a challenge, is to have central funding instead of letting each local government fund their own schools. If central government can centralize funding, then if rural kids can use this funding to go to school anywhere, this will be ideal solution. Of course, this is hard to do as a policy. How much time do I have, John? 5. Okay, I can do 5 minutes for the one you want, actually. So this is my first part of the talk. The second part, I'm talking about something else, about social education, because Chao really want to hear about this education inequality in China. Basically, I have this data set of the universe of all Gaokao takers, all China's college exam takers in a few years. I'm using 2003 as an example. So these are China's universities. This basically top 2. I don't want to say. Everyone knows who that is. Not Fudan. So sorry. And top 9 include Fudan. 95 basically this is elite college in China. Around 40 colleges. 211, the second tier of elite, around 100. This university, this is basic college in the US. This is community college, 3-year community college. Okay, let me give you a rough number. So the admission rate of these top schools is very low. So in total, less than like 5%. So let me give you a picture of this data. This is the universe of every exam taker. So this is the urban rural gap. If you look at the total scores, the rural kids basically, this is rural, this is urban, on average did better than urban kids in the exam. But this is admission. I look at the admission. So I move to the right, basically moving to higher quality colleges. The admission rate of rural kids declines dramatically, actually. So for community college, break even, basically for rural. This is the percent of rural kids in the data. If we go down to the top 2, Tsinghua and Beida, admitted, sorry, I said the name, admitted around 18% from rural areas, even though exam takers occupy about like 52% of the data. Of course, there are many rural kids who are not even taking the exam. So this is really low. This is rural bias. I have other data, I don't have time to show it. So the second one is I want to show is the repeating advantage. I was surprised by data as well. So about 20% of the kids are repeating exam takers. And repeat takers, they do much better than the non-repeaters. So this is the percentile of the scores of the exam. They have like 10% percentage point higher scores than their peers. What 10% means? We have like 10 million exam takers. 10% means 1 million. 1 million means like several layers of colleges. Because it's so competitive. Okay, repeat exam takers, they do pretty well actually. Even in top 2, Tsinghua, Beida, they are about 11% of the students who are admitted by this tool are repeat exam takers. Who repeat exams? Yeah, those are from rich families, actually. They don't care about waiting for one more year. Okay, The third one is the home bias. This is a pretty sensitive issue, actually, to talk about. This is the distribution of colleges in China across provinces. This is very small. Let me show you some dramatic picture. This is the elite colleges in China. You can see that Beijing is a city in China. It's only about 1% of the population, but it has 25 the elite colleges in China. In total, there are only 100. Beijing has like a quarter of it. And then followed by Jiangsu and Shanghai. These three places have maybe almost half. If you go to a higher level, so Beijing also ranks so high, Beijing, Shanghai, and Shanxi, three places. Half the provinces don't have any of the really elite colleges in China. Why do this matter? Because if your province has an elite college, then the chance of you getting into that elite college is much higher than kids from other provinces. So this is an admission from local population. Basically, the least biased colleges in China are Beida and Tsinghua. They only admit 21% from Beijing. Remember, Beijing's population is only about 1% of the whole country, but they admit 21% from Beijing, Shanghai. Beijing. If you look at Fudan and other places, they are even more biased. Fudan admit like 40% from Shanghai. So basically, if I write a simple regression, basically this is the number of students the colleges in your province admit a year. This is a chance of getting into that layer of colleges. It's basically look like a 45-degree line. So the last bias I talk about is elite high school bias. China's division or segregation of students does not start from college. Started from kindergarten, actually. I live in Beijing for quite a while. Both of my kids went to local school. So they also went to different schools in Hong Kong and the US. So both of them went to 4 different schools in the past 2 years. Kids are very resilient anyway. So I understand education very well of all different places. So this is high schools. Let me give you one calculation. So we all know Gini coefficient. When we say Gini coefficient income of 40% is very high. China Gini coefficient in income is about 48%, has come down from almost 0.5 to 0.48, which is quite good in a sense. What is Gini in education? I calculated the high school Gini so each high school can send a few kids to the top 2 universities a year, and then we can have distribution of each high school, and then we can draw the Lawrence curve and calculate the Gini coefficient. What will be the Gini coefficient of this education inequality? Remember, income Gini coefficient in China is 0.48. What would your guess be for the Gini coefficient for education? This high school Gini coefficient. What's your guess? Anybody? Point what? Okay. That's very close. So for top 2, it's about 96%, 0.96. Even for 2 and 1, it's 0.8, very high. That means, what does it mean? That means only a few high schools can produce students who go to elite colleges in China. I calculated the number. Basically, top 10 high schools contributed 100%. I'm finishing. 100% of the top 10 high schools contributing 100% of Beida Tsinghua students, basically. If you're not going to the top school, top high school in your city, the chance we are going to Tsinghua Beida is 0. No chance. So basically, so this is the end. I'm running out of time. Basically, who can go to China's colleges or elite colleges? They are from urban areas, rich families, elite high school, advantageous provinces. So what should we reform? We should think about the college entrance exam, Gaokao. People may think this is a fair exam. The outcome is far from fair, actually, or equal. Now, fair is the wrong word for economy, from equal. And it causes a lot of economic inefficiency. So I'm stopping here. Thank you.
We are running behind time, so I'm going to take 2 questions. question is short.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I have one question about your economic growth reasoning, and then you're mostly focusing about education's level and its correlation with the economic growth. Have you, but you didn't mention about like a structural transformation or like demand side of the labor market. Yeah.
Okay, basically, it's a variable fate, so it's a dot and the line, right? The distance between the dot and line is called residual. So that residual is what you are talking about. Actually, everything else is in the residual.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
China's government have very strict regulation on the entry of private investment in college education market. So in other words, this market is not a free market. Do you think that engaging in market force is going to solve this problem or worsen the situation? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. Actually, I think China, by the figure you can see that China has only top two colleges, which is, I think, can be improved a lot actually. So that you can see that every year there are around 250,000 students coming to the US to study. There's a huge market here. I mean, if China continues to restrict this, China will be in trouble, actually. I work in Tsinghua. I help Tsinghua to recruit the top students from China. Unfortunately, the top students are not even going to China's colleges. They're all here, I mean, going to Stanford, Harvard. So I think that's a very good question. China should open the market, actually.
Okay, well. We're having our second speaker, Professor Gary Jefferson.
Well, thank you. You don't have a, thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. We actually only got the data for this about 5 weeks ago, so this is the first rollout of this research. I prepared this jointly with Jiang Renai, who's a visiting scholar at Brandeis from Xi'an Jiao Tong University, Li Tong, who prepared the data set, presently a PhD student at Princeton, and Sam Zucker, a undergraduate research assistant at Brandeis. So what I'd like to do is to sort of briefly just give you a profile of Chinese patent production and a view of how that compares with the US and some other OECD countries. And then I'd like to analyze the data in order to investigate a few questions. The first is sort of how the number of inventors or, say, team research affects patent quality in China and as compared with the US. And then how the assignment of ownership in terms of the distribution of assignees also affects patent quality. And we have data on the nationality of the inventors, and for assignees, we also have data on the organizations with which they are associated, either corporations, universities, or research institutes. So there has been some work done on this, and I will, given the time constraint, not dwell upon this, except to say that these folks have done some research using an earlier data set, concluding that indeed there has been an evolution of the phenomenon of team research, both in the production of published journal articles and also in patenting. And we also find that to be the case. So here's a brief overview of the distribution of patents in the US Patent and Trademark Office. You can see that for China, as for South Korea, there has been a very impressive surge in patenting. These are patents that have actually been granted by the USPTO. And, but still in 2015, China had only about 5% of the granted patents that the U.S. Had in that year. So there's some question as to why we are looking at the U.S. PTO instead of SIPO, the State Intellectual Property Office data. We do this because, as you can see, SIPO has a large proportion, indeed majority, of its patents that are relatively low quality. That is, they're design patents or utility patents. More importantly, the U.S. has many more foreign patents. That is, about half of the patents that are filed and approved in the U.S. are foreign or international patents. And so for that reason, we are looking at U.S. PTO patents. We also see from our data that, interestingly, the typical Chinese patent seems to embody more international collaboration than the counterpart U.S. patent. So, as I said, Li-Lin Tong had prepared this data. Much of it is readily available on the U.S. PTO. Li-Lin Tong was able to incorporate various forward citations into the data set, which helped with our quality measures of the patents. And so what we use for measuring quality is backward citations, claims, and forward citations. So the claims are actually specifications on the patent application when it's submitted, indicating what the inventor or inventors believe are the novel features of their invention. And then the patent examiners will go through the various claims and evaluate those against existing patents and state of the knowledge in order to determine whether or not they are indeed valid claims and indeed define the breadth of the patent. Backward citations are those that are included in the patent application, again, which the inventor or inventors have identified as having been relevant sources of information and inspiration in developing the patent. Forward citations are those which result subsequent to the approval of the patent, so that the subsequent patents that may be filed, if I had patented 10 years ago, subsequent patents may have cited my patent as an important source of information and inspiration in the development of that future patent. So those are the three measures that we use of quality. We see here numbers with regard to the average number of backward citations. It's somewhat interesting, for the U.S. we see this spike in backward citations. This is something that we are looking at now. We think it is a measure of a degree of home bias, in that in 2005, the United States Patent Office assigned patent examiners with the responsibility of going back through the literature and patents and adding backward citations where those may have been missing from the patent applications. And it may be that these patent applications from English sources had some sort of an advantage with regard to the augmentation of their backward patents. But this is a matter that's under study now. We see that the average number of claims has increased somewhat over the years. It's interesting to see China in that in 2015, its average number of claims is kind of at a OECD kind of level, at the lower end of that, comparable to Japan, and somewhat less than that of Germany and the EU. although we should emphasize that these are simply averages, and these are rather uneven distributions, actually. And then we have the average number of forward citations also. And what happens in 2015, of course, is that these drop off to virtually zero because these are new patents that are just coming online, so that new research and patent applications haven't yet had an opportunity to reference the new patents that have come online. So China in particular has been somewhat disadvantaged by that, given the fact that most of its patents have materialized in the USPTO over the last 10 years. So these are various inputs to patent quality. And again, we're particularly interested in the international dimension of this in terms of the number and the origin of the inventors and the number and origin of the assignees as well. And these other factors, of course, R&D spending and intellectual property rights all matter. Those are kind of taken as we could talk about those, but those are kind of taken as given. So what we see here, again, is quite consistent with previous research that seems to indicate that there has been an increase in team collaboration for China as well as other countries. And I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to go. I'm sorry?
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Oh, well, then I'll go back to the beginning. So let's move into the empirical piece of this. So what we do, we have 3 measures of patent quality. And what we want to do initially is look at the implications of the number of inventors and the fact of whether there was or was not one from a foreign country, meaning international collaboration, among those inventors. And what we see here, we'll just, given some time constraints, we'll just look at the U.S. sample and the Chinese sample. Our data run from 1975 to 2015. But what we see, if I had a pointer, I could, we see that here for the U.S., the number of inventors, indeed, these are t-statistics. The reasons are using these instead of standard errors. A number of econometric issues, if anyone wants to talk about those later. But you can see that so all of these along this row, estimates are very robust, indicating that for the U.S., indeed, there seems to be substantial benefits to domestic collaboration. The more inventors, the better. If we look with regard to their international character, we somewhat surprisingly see a row of negative estimates suggesting that indeed when a U.S. company or university engages with researchers abroad, it may be that that collaboration actually erodes the quality of the patent rather than improving the quality of the patent. I guess the only sort of anecdotal story I might have would be that of, say, the Chinese policy of technology for markets, requiring Chinese companies, say, to collaborate with American companies to collaborate with a Chinese company, in which case it may be that the U.S. company wants to satisfy the expectation that they will transfer some technology, but that technology that they transfer is sort of not their frontier technology. It's something to sort of get above the bar so that they can claim that they've indeed satisfied the technology requirement of the Chinese side. But if we look at the China case, we see that for the sample of Chinese patents, indeed the estimates are also generally positive. One's negative. They're less positive than for the U.S. side, suggesting there may be less payoff within China for inventor collaboration. Whereas for the international participation, we see that those estimates are positive and very robust, suggesting that there are very, in contrast to the US, where it may be that the implications of international collaboration are negative with respect to patent quality, it seems that for China that they are really quite strikingly positive. And but we want to look at some individual sectors, in order to break this down a little further and see if this result indeed also persists for these four sectors. And we see that indeed they do. That is, here we have for automobiles, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and solar, we have, again, positive, negative for the US, positive, positive for China. We have positive, negative, again, in terms of domestic collaboration versus international collaboration for the US, and positive, positive for China. And the same pattern also for semiconductors and the solar sector. So again, this gives more confirmation that it seems that international collaboration generates a much larger payoff for the Chinese than it does for their American counterparts. So we're also interested in assignee ownership. That is, after the patent has been reviewed and approved, then its ownership is specified. That is, the assignees are determined, and they are likely to be a subset of the inventors. It may be one inventor, it may possibly be all of the inventors. And given the time constraint, and I would like to leave time available for questions and answers, let me simply say that for the pattern of assignees, we see that it's really quite similar to that of inventors. That is, there tend to be sort of positive payback, for American patent filing organizations when they collaborate with a domestic entity in terms of ownership assignment, but negative for international assignment, and the reverse seems to be the case for the Chinese. So I would like to leave some time here to look at one last feature here, and what we're going to do is to incorporate information not only about domestic generically and foreign generically, but now we're also able to identify whether the domestic collaborators and the international collaborators were corporations, whether they were universities, whether they were research institutes, and how different combinations, configurations of those organizational collaborations may have affected patent quality in terms of a university and a research institute, or a research institute and a university. And what we see here, let me just say, there are two different hypotheses I have. One is the incentive effect. And that would be that if indeed the number of assignees is large relative to the number of inventors, in the extreme, if every inventor is also an assignee, that is, every inventor enjoys ownership, then I would say that the incentive effect of that scheme is high. On the other hand, if, let's say there's only one assignee and there are 10 inventors, then I would characterize it as a scale effect, right? So, this could be General Electric as someone that is, has a large staff working on research institute on patents. They come up with a novel idea. Each of them gets paid $1, but and a bonus. But there's some, but it's only General Electric that owns the patent. And so we look at those two different schemes, and what it means is that the smaller the ratio, we would expect, the greater the scale effect, right? That is, the larger the number of inventors relative to assignees. If that's negative, the scale effect dominates. If it's positive, then the incentive effect dominates. And what we see here is, if we look at this pattern, we see many more positive estimates for the Chinese possibilities than we do the U.S. And just numerically, as we count these in terms of the signs of the estimates, we see that I think only 3 of these are positive for the U.S., suggesting a negative relationship, that is, the more assignees relative to inventors, so the lower the quality of the patent, suggesting the scale effect's really important. Maybe 1 or only a few assignees, but lots of inventors, none of whom receive any of the ownership benefits explicitly, versus China, where it seems that the incentive effect is most striking and robust. That is to the extent that inventors can anticipate that they'll also be assignees and have some kind of ownership claim. It seems to enhance patent quality. So that is, so those are the key results. I would say that if there's a conclusion within the context of the policy and debate concerning leadership's orientation toward indigenous innovation, where we see that the amount that's being spent on imported technology has been falling quite dramatically relative to R&D spending. Our results would suggest that that may be, the emphasis on indigenous technology may be mistaken, and China should try to open up and collaborate as much as possible, both with regard to research collaboration and also ownership collaboration. Thank you.
So we will take 2 questions. I will first connect all questions and we can answer together.
Hi, I'm Alex Hammer, U.S. International Trade Commission, and also your former student. So,
Yes, indeed. I may or may not answer your question.
thank you for this. I found that the attempts to try to measure quality in patents is remarkable, and there are very few studies who have been able to effectively do this. So, I guess my specific question is on the claims part. I think you were saying that the inventors, it's really what the inventors claim is novel. So if
As verified by the patent examiners.
okay, so in your when you look at this, if you have, let's say, 5 novel elements to one patent versus 3 novel elements to another patent, you're saying that that would suggest that it's a higher quality. Okay, so that's the best of what we can do.
Yeah.
Even though they
defines the breadth of the patent, which means that it becomes more difficult for others to infringe perhaps upon the intellectual property that's embedded in that patent, the new patent.
Okay.
In general, on average. We've looked at a few patents specifically, some of which seem ridiculous and not have any value, others which seem to acknowledgeably have value, and they tend to fit that pattern.
But in theory, there could be a breakthrough technology in one of them that would just be counted as a number.
It's wonderful, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions?
Mary.
I just have a point of clarification. When you have, say, a Chinese and a U.S. researcher, how do you actually identify the place of origin or where the R&D takes place, since many Chinese scientists are actually working in the
Yep.
U.S. when making the discoveries?
Solely by geography, their address. Yeah, on the address on the patent application, that's right. So that's not to say that there aren't foreigners in China, that are engaged in the research, or Chinese abroad who are engaged in research. If they're abroad, they are recorded as being international from the Chinese perspective. And if an American is in China, perhaps working with a joint venture company, it's quite likely they would be designated as domestic or Chinese.
Now let's invite our third speaker, Professor Andrew Greenland.
Do you see yours? I'm actually wondering. No, you sent it.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. This is a co-authored paper with two of my colleagues, John Lopresti and Peter McHenry at William & Mary. What I'm going to be talking about is more on the U.S. side of things and taking a look at how the U.S. economy has responded in terms of the China shock. Specifically, a lot of people have been talking about this today. I'm going to talk about it in the U.S. context. We can take a look at Chinese export growth and U.S. export growth. And there's been a huge trend upward in China's exporting behavior starting in about 1990, and it really ticks upward at that vertical line here, which is in 2001 when China enters the World Trade Organization. There's been a substantial literature that has been thinking quite carefully about what the costs and benefits of that export growth are for the U.S. economy. The primary results we get out of this literature are that while the gains are broadly spread throughout the economy in terms of lower cost of goods and services, higher quality goods and services, lower cost of intermediate inputs for producers of goods and services. The costs are very, very highly concentrated among subsets of the population and geographically. In particular, individuals who are working in manufacturing, who are historically among the lower education and lower wage groups within the United States, have seen losses in wages, employment rates and employment prospects, increases in unemployment, worse physical and mental health, and even increased mortality risk over this period. And geographically, what we observe is that labor markets that are disproportionately employing these set of individuals also suffer consequences for laborers not directly competing with Chinese manufacturing, primarily through losses in income, which means consumers have less money to spend even on non-tradable goods and services, which has led to a decrease in the tax base in some of those areas, undercutting public funding for things like schools and other institutions. The question that we're interested in at this point, and first let me make a small disclaimer here. This is not meant to be an anti-globalization standpoint, okay? I think fully that the benefits pointed out in these top two papers, if you haven't given them a look, are both fantastic looks at NBER's recent work on the benefits of U.S.-China trade relations, that overwhelmingly the benefits exceed the costs, okay? However, because the costs are so highly concentrated in particular areas, it's a puzzle in this literature that no one to this point has documented any sort of migratory response out of affected labor markets, okay? And so that's what we're going to take a look at in this paper. We're going to ask the following question: is there a migratory response to the China shock? Second, if there is, who do we observe moving at this point? And third, how quickly are people responding? Okay. In order to answer this question, we're going to take the two primary treatments of the China shock in the literature so far. We're going to work with the Pearson-Schott treatment of the China shock, which is based on an uncertainty mechanism. And we're also going to take the Otterdoorn and Hansen approach, which is based on a supply-side growth mechanism. We're going to take both of these measures of the China shock, and we're going to take a look at three distinct data sets to analyze migratory responses. The first data sets we're going to look at are aggregate labor market level data sets provided by the census and IPMs. Next, we'll be taking a look at individual longitudinal data so we can track people over time as they make migratory choices. And finally, we're going to take a look at annual migration flows as proxied by exemptions and returns on IRS 1040 filings. Okay. I'll talk about each of these data sets in turn as we get closer to the relevant results section. As a brief preview of the findings, what we observe are reductions in population growth in affected areas, ranging from 1.7 to 3.2 percentage points. Okay, these are economically meaningful effects. The largest response tends to take place among adults under 35 years old, so individuals we anticipate having low costs of migration. But encouragingly, it's also taking place among individuals who are most exposed to the China shock. Okay, those are individuals who are disproportionately employed in manufacturing, men and low-educated workers. Okay. We find evidence of people leaving shocked areas as well as avoiding resettling in those areas. And to tie in with the existing literature and why no result has been seen on this so far, as we move on to estimating the dynamics of the shock using the IRS data, we'll document that the bulk of this reaction takes place at about a 7 to 12-year lag after China was granted normal trade relations. And so insofar as the existing literature is looking at a much shorter window of time, it's not terribly surprising that we haven't seen a migratory response to this point. The other problem in the literature so far in terms of identification is the fact that the places that were most impacted by the China shock had growing populations before this. Okay, so you can think of North Carolina as an example that was experiencing tremendous growth during this period. The population is trending upward. The China shock eliminates enough jobs that if you were to not take into account that population trend, what you would see is the population looks approximately similar before and after. But once you account for the trend in this behavior, you can see that there is a substantial downward adjustment in population growth over this period. I think these findings are important for two reasons. The first is, as we think as proponents of globalization and trade, one of the key mechanisms we should be concerned about is labor reallocation from shocked sectors into expanding sectors to make sure we realize the gains from trade. Okay. The second is the existing literature on the China shock depends largely on an assumption of no migration in order for the results to be interpreted as causal. Okay? And what I mean by that is, if we take, for example, Otterdoorn and Hansen, who take a look at average household incomes as one of their outcomes, by looking at the average household income before and after the China shock, we are implicitly assuming that we are taking that average over the same set of individuals. Okay? But if there's substantial migration and shifts in that population, then what we're actually measuring is a compositional shift in the labor force as well as a direct treatment effect. So because of the directions of migration, we observe that low-skill workers are actually leaving these areas. We would think that should mechanically push up the wages, as low-skilled and young adults have lower wage profiles generally, which would mean in the face of the China shock, we should observe increases in wages. That Otterdoorn and Hansen still find negative effects means they may have been larger than previously documented. Okay? However, the caveat here is that this bias holds for any sort of research being done in this literature where it's looking at average outcomes across individuals in a population, and the bias need not go in that same direction. Okay? So we need to be careful about thinking about this migration as potentially undermining our identification of the China shock in this literature. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to explain our basic strategy. For the bulk of our analysis, we're going to rely on the Pearson-Schott treatment. It's a simpler interpretation, and then we'll go to the Otterdoorn and Hansen treatment of the China shock shortly. The basic idea behind the Pearson-Schott treatment is that starting in the 1980s, China was granted normal trade relations, which meant they got very low tariff rates, but there was uncertainty about those tariff rates being renewed every year after that. And so that presented substantial downside risk to exporters from China, who said, I need to know what the price is going to be when I show up in country of my goods and services. And so that was alleviated in 2001 when China was granted permanent normal trade relations with the US, at which point the risk that the US could suddenly increase tariffs or not renew the normal trade relations disappeared. And so what we actually observed during this period is the industries for which that downside risk was the largest. Okay, that's where the tariffs could have gone up by the most. Those are the places we saw substantial growth in exports after China entered the World Trade Organization. So what we're going to do is we're going to calculate this gap. That is, how bad tariffs could have been if they didn't get normal trade relations and what they were under permanent normal trade relations. Okay? That is just for each one of these industries, we're going to take the difference between what they actually were and how bad it could have been. And we're going to take a weighted average of these within a labor market. Okay, so that for each labor market, we're calculating, on average, how exposed are your workers to this incoming export growth from China. We'll use this interquartile range of 5.8 percentage points for discussions later on, but that's where we'll start. As our measure of labor markets, we're going to stick with the standard in this literature and use commuting zones, which are approximations of labor markets insofar as most of the people live and work in the same commuting zone. So it's a reasonable approximation for the types of places people may go to work. We can see that this is a strongly geographically clustered shock. Again, we're going to see a lot of the effect in the South and in the Midwest of the United States, with a smattering of it elsewhere. As our first attempt to take a look at the migratory response to the China shock, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the census data, and we're going to take changes in the log population from 1990 to 2000 and 2000 to 2010. Our key explanatory variable here is our normal trade relations gap, that is that weighted average in risk, okay? And we're going to interact that with a post-2001 dummy so that after 2001, as this risk disappears, this should be the period in which we see the most export growth and consequently the most largest migratory response. As I mentioned, because there are trends in these populations, we're also going to account for the lagged population growth on the right-hand side and a plethora of controls to account for possible demographic factors that may drive migration, potential differences in production technologies in different locales, and other confounding effects due to the financial crisis and housing market crisis during this period. I'll show you here that sequentially we'll introduce each of those groups of controls. And on the left-hand side of this panel, we're going to look at the full working age population, that is 15 to 64-year-old adults. And on the right, we'll take a look at 15 to 34-year-old adults. The difference between columns 3 and 4 is we're not going to account for those housing market controls, but it does reduce our sample size. And so we're going to stick with our baseline estimates in column 3. It doesn't make a large change for interpretation of these point estimates. But what we'll see is this normal trade relations gap has a negative and significant effect on population growth, and that lagged population growth is very strongly correlated with future population growth. Okay? This failure to account for this, we believe, has led to some of the non-result in the literature about migratory response. In terms of an interquartile move in this normal trade relations exposure, how big is the economic magnitude of this effect? We see about 1.7 percentage point reduction in population growth among the working age population and nearly double that for individuals under 35 years old. For a point of comparison, that's 20% of the adjustment among 15 to 34-year-olds across our entire sample is driven by this effect. Within these commuting zones, what we'll do is we'll further take a look at particular demographics that might have been affected the most. The largest effects here are for males, individuals without a high school diploma, and individuals who have a high school diploma but haven't completed college, okay, so college dropouts. And these are the people that we expect were most affected by labor market competition. In terms of individual data, what we'll do is we'll take a look at two data sets here, the Ls and the Nels, which are longitudinal surveys put on by the Department of Education that track individuals over time. The Nels 88 started in 1988 and concluded in 2000. The Els 2002 actually started in 2001 and concluded in 2013. So what we have is one of these two groups was exposed to the treatment and the other was not. Okay? And so with the same difference in different strategy, what we'll see is that there's an interquartile increase of a 5% chance increase in moving out of a shocked area and a 7.6% chance reduction of resettling in a trade shocked area. Okay, so what we're observing is young adults who are leaving these areas, not returning, and who are avoiding going to other trade shocked areas. Thank you. In order to assess the dynamics of the adjustment, take a look at the speed at which this is occurring, what we'll do is we'll take a look, we'll estimate what's called a distributed lag model, where basically we'll say, what's the change in the population each year after the China shock? We'll take a look at that average effect and what the cumulative effect is over this entire period from 1990 to 2013. Only 13 of those years are obviously post the shock. And for this, we do it in an unconstrained fashion in the paper, but for this, we'll constrain this polynomially, like a previous paper we saw, so that we get a nice, clean functional form here. What we'll see is a dip in the population growth immediately. This is the marginal effect here. That is the year-on-year effect is on the left-hand side, and the cumulative effect will be on your right-hand side. So this marginal effect is negative and significant in the first 2 years, about 0, and then continues to build over time. We think as more and more of these manufacturing jobs disappear, just because normal trade relations were guaranteed in 2001, that's not the moment that all of the jobs disappeared within the US labor markets. Okay, so as those continue to build, our interpretation of this is we saw a continued increase in migratory response here. Over the same period, we get a similar magnitude of about a 3.1 percentage point reduction over 12 years as compared to about a 2 percentage point reduction in the census data. Finally, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a look at the Otterdoorn and Hansen treatment. And to do this, we're going to take a look at a slightly different mechanism. Otterdoorn and Hansen argue that much of the growth in Chinese exports can be explained by things we just heard about, like mass migration into cities, which led to huge productivity increases, which led to huge exporting behavior. And so what we're going to do is we're going to explore these supply-side shocks that could be driving exporting behavior and take a look at how that drives population adjustments. Now, in the first the first row here, we'll just take a look at replicating Otterdoorn and Hansen's results, making sure we've got their sample exact, we've calculated everything appropriately, and these point estimates match to within a thousandth of a point. In the next column, what we're going to do is we're going to just include this lagged population growth that we think is so important. And what you'll notice is the point estimates on all of these increase by an order of magnitude. The standard errors have gone down, but they're not significant at conventional levels. The final thing we're going to do here is we're going to recognize that from our distributed lag model, much of this effect occurred beyond a 7-year window. If we take a look at the original Otter sample after 2001, they're looking at about a 6-year window, 2001 to 2007. And so to account for this difference, what we'll actually do is we'll expand this to 2010 to match our census results. And when we do that, we see a strikingly similar pattern that we see population adjustments of about 1.5 percentage points among the working age population, among individuals without a college degree, and large effects among young adults. Overall, in conclusion, we look at this as a paper to provide some evidence of economic recovery in the face of the China shock, that we are seeing migration out of commuting zones affected negatively by Chinese labor market competition. The effect seems to be strongest among individuals with low trade costs, young adults, and individuals who are most negatively impacted by this, or the demographics of the individuals who are most negatively impacted by this. Okay? Men and individuals under 35. We can identify this effect regardless of which of the two China treatment shocks we use. And we just point out that this should be a word of caution to researchers actively working in this area, that thinking about using the Otterdoorn-Hansen or Pierce shot treatment of the China shock with any sort of left-hand side variable that reflects an average, okay, a health rate of some sort, or unemployment rate, or average wage. These things are susceptible to changes in the population, not just changes in the actual exposure to the China shock itself. Okay, thank you.
So we'll have to pause the session for a second.
Thank you, Professor Greenland. That was a very interesting talk. I just had 2 points of curiosity. Mm-hmm. The first is, how do you define trade shocked areas in your paper? And the second related is, do you follow through with where those people actually move to when they're out of the trade shocked areas? And if it's a consistent story with what we heard during the keynote today, where Professor Wei told us that a lot of people gain jobs in the downstream industries of manufacturing. And just, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Can I take another question?
Hi, I think my question somewhat relates to hers. Recently, I attended a conference. It was on policy in Africa, and they discussed the migration of many Chinese to Africa, and I don't remember the exact number, but they had estimates of about 200 million living, 200 to 300 million. It was pretty large. living in Africa within the next 10 years or so. Would you would you speak to that and the impact? Did you do any work on that?
Yeah, let me address that one first. I would be glad to speak to it, but my research on migratory reactions is primarily within the context of the United States and U.S. labor markets. So unfortunately, I won't be able to lend any insight into Chinese migratory patterns into Africa. As to your original question, how do we measure trade shocks? There's two ways of thinking about it. One is thinking about per worker in a particular area, what is the increase in the goods and services that are coming into the country that are going to be competing with the things that I do for a living, okay? So I work in shoe manufacturing, $10,000 of new shoes are shipped in per worker. That's a substantial increase in competition that in an industry that I would be trying to produce those goods and services for, okay? So that's the Otto-Dorn and Hansen treatment. They take a look at it on a actual growth in exports manner, and they take a weighted average by saying, okay, there's a lot of shoemakers in one county, but not a lot in the other, and so that one county or that one commuting zone is going to have a relatively large impact from the shoe industry. The other way would be to aggregate it using this tariff uncertainty idea, and so the idea is basically if I have an industry that's facing currently a 2% tariff, but tomorrow that could increase to 12%. Well, that increase is really a 10% increase in my price, and that's something that might make it really tough for me to sell my goods and services abroad. And so because I don't know what that price is going to be, I may have to stop exporting or wait until I see what that is likely to be permanently in the future, okay? And so what you could do is you could look at for each one of those industries how much the price could go up if trade relations deteriorated with China. What we observed is after 2001, when China was granted permanent normal trade relations on their entry to the World Trade Organization, meaning those prices couldn't shoot up without a lot of due process and other facets of international trade policy, those industries that had the biggest potential increases in price are the ones that grew the most. And so again, we'll take a weighted average of those saying, the tariffs in shoes could have gone up a lot. This region has a lot of shoemakers. This one doesn't have a lot of shoemakers, so the effect of shoemakers is going to be large here, but not here, okay? And we take an average over all of the industries, and so we can get a picture based on that graph to say something like, I don't know where it is. We can get a picture of something like, on average, in this labor market, how much does your average worker face competition from China, okay? Yep. Thank you.